I'm Mitzi Jonelle Tan, and I'm a full-time climate justice activist with Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, or YACAP, which is the Fridays for Future of our country. I also organize a lot with international communities, such as the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, Fridays for Future International, Fridays for Future MAPA, which is most affected people in areas, Youth Climate Justice Fund, and the Climate Justice Club Fellowship, and a few other things. But basically, a lot of my work revolves around raising awareness to the climate crisis in different ways. So that means doing protests and speeches and campaigns, but also going to frontline communities, learning from their experiences and creating modules, climate modules that are contextualized to their experience, but also when there are typhoons, we do relief operations here in the Philippines. We also talk a lot about the intersectionality of the climate crisis and how colonialism, the profit-oriented system, has really driven the climate crisis, especially in countries like the Philippines. And then human rights stuff is also stuff that we talk about in a few other things.
So I'm curious, what got you interested in the climate crisis and all the other issues that you work on? Is there a specific moment that you can point back to that sort of sparked your interest? Or was it more of a gradual process of getting involved?
So when I was younger, I grew up seeing the impacts of the climate crisis, just like almost every other Filipino. Because we are one of the most vulnerable in the world to the climate crisis. We experience an average of 20 super typhoons a year. And it's just something that is a reality. But I didn't know that what we were experiencing, how the floods that we were seeing, that this was the climate crisis. Because it wasn't taught to us that way. The way it was taught to us in school was if we didn't have climate change in our education, it would be very westernized, very technical, very alienating, and very foreign, and not something that actually is contextualized to our experience. It wasn't until 2017 when I was able to talk to a Lumad indigenous leader. He was telling us about how they were being harassed and displaced and killed and militarized, all for protecting the planet, all for protecting their ancestral land. And then ever so simply, he shrugged and chuckled and said, that's why we have no choice but to fight back. And that burst my bubble of privilege, and I realized that I had no choice as well but to join the struggle of our environmental defenders, of the people in the front lines. And that's when I started to intentionally learn about the climate crisis. Well, first, the environmental crisis that we're facing in the Philippines, which of course led to understanding the climate crisis more. And there, I've been a full-time activist since 2019, and just kept going ever since.
Have you ever had moments where, as a full-time activist, you felt like nothing was really being done?
I definitely get those moments, especially with world leaders. When I'm with communities on the front line, when I'm with activists, and I'm in organizing spaces, I know that I can see that things are happening and that we are demanding for better. But if we look at the world leaders and we see what they're doing at these conferences, how investments in the fossil fuel industry continue to rise, how environmentally destructive projects continue to be put up, especially in countries like the Philippines and in the global south. And then there you see I feel that frustration that the world leaders aren't doing enough. And that's actually where a lot of my climate anxiety comes from. So with my climate anxiety, a lot of it isn't just from the extreme weather events and the typhoons that are happening around us, but also from the betrayal of our world leaders, of our national leaders for not doing enough. So I see the destruction. We see the destruction happening around us, and then we see the response as if it's not there. And it's almost like we're being gaslit, like, oh, we're doing something, or but this is what we're doing because this is all, but it doesn't match the intensity of the destruction that's happening, if there is any action.
So in your last response, you mentioned eco-anxiety or climate anxiety. So building off of that, what message would you give to climate activists or youth around the world who are affected by eco-anxiety?
I think it's really important to honor that feeling and to make space for it. When I started feeling it, I was almost mad at myself for not being able to turn it immediately into action, like it really debilitated me for some time, and I was almost frustrated with myself that I was feeling it, because I felt like you're supposed to have hope, Mitzi. You're supposed to care, you know?
Yeah.
A friend who's also in the climate movement said, Mitzi, just allow yourself to grieve, because there is a lot of grief that's happening around you. And I think learning to honor those feelings and to make space for both feelings of climate joy and climate anxiety and anger, they're all so important to really understand the complexity of what we're facing. It's understanding that we're anxious because we're seeing something wrong. You know, we're feeling these emotions because something is wrong. That means we're more in line with the planet and with the environment. That's why we know that something's wrong. We are in a world that is in a system that is broken. So it's completely normal to also feel that. It just means that we're a lot more aware and in line with what's actually happening around us.
I understand that you do a lot of public speaking in like the activism sphere. So what advice would you sort of give to aspiring activists who don't know where to start and are intimidated by the prospect of being an activist, like protesting and speaking and things like that?
I think the first thing I would say that you don't need to be a public speaker to be an activist. You can have, people who carry you the water jugs around, like the people behind you. There is a role for every single person. And if you prefer to do background work like Excel sheets and lists and documents and planning and strategizing, that's so important. And a bulk of my work is actually that. A lot of it is actually monitoring things, looking at documents, looking at like insights and looking at numbers, but also talking to a lot of people, doing a lot of meetings. The public speeches and the protests, they're small moments that do a lot of work, but then it's like an iceberg, right? Where like you only see the tip of it, and what's actually holding it all up is the work that everyone else is doing here in the bottom. If you do want to be a public speaker, then I think what helps is practicing a lot and with your friends, with your family. I still get my friends to read through my speeches sometimes. And I think the more honest you are with yourself and with what you're saying, it changes a lot. Know your facts, be very comfortable with the science as well. So that you're able to communicate it the way that you want to be communicated to, right? Like I personally hate when people do like political jargon, all these policy words. So I'm not going to speak like that. But there are people who appreciate that kind of language, so you can do that as well. It really is just practice and remembering that you have a very unique voice and experience and context that other people don't have, so you can speak to that and never feel like, oh, I'm not good enough, because you have an experience that needs and deserves to be heard, and you have a story of resistance that deserves to be heard. So really lean into that. Lean into what makes you, what makes your experience different, what makes your context special.
What is the number one action you would encourage everyone watching to take to help the environment?
To get organized, join a group, join an organization, because your small thing can add up to bigger things. You also find it's community that gets to hold you and embrace and hold you accountable, and it helps you grow as an activist. The key thing to address the climate crisis through collective action, and we do that by becoming organizers ourselves. I think it's really important, like more than mobilizing in the streets, more than protesting, more than the campaigns even, what's crucial and what's important is that people get organized. And of course, how do they get organized? Through the campaigns, through the mobilization. That's where people find you. But then it's really important that people come in and become organizers themselves. And then the impact kind of triple and quadruple, et cetera, et cetera.
You recently wrote an article on climate reparations. Could you explain / summarize climate reparations for somebody who may not be aware of what they are, and kind of talk about why you think they're necessary?
That was actually a hard article for me to write, because I didn't realize how many definitions climate reparations had, and I didn't know where to start and how to simplify it. Yeah. But basically, essentially, it's the understanding that the global north and certain institutions and multinational companies in the richest of the world, which includes the fossil fuel industry, are the ones who caused the climate crisis. And so climate finance, these things, aid, they're not aid. They're not there for support. They're paying what they broke. To put it very simply, they broke something, so they have to pay for it. They broke our climate. They broke our environment, so they have to pay for it now. And this doesn't just fall under money, which should be in the form of grants, but this also includes technology transfer to ensure that when the global south is transitioning into renewable energy, we don't end up going into debt for the intellectual property rights of these renewable energy systems when the minerals and the materials for these renewable energy systems came from our country, and we're the ones who deserve to have this technology as well because it has been kept away from us. It's understanding that all of these fall under the idea of climate reparations, and it can get really technical, like you have the loss and damage fund, we have funds for mitigation and adaptation, but it's also essentially finances for small fisher folk when their fisher boats get destroyed, for urban poor communities whose houses are swept away with the floods. These are supposed to look like on the ground. It's supposed to directly help the people who are already impacted, both before in the past and now and in the future.
What is your message for world leaders today, and what actions do you hope to see in the coming years?
For world leaders today, they need to prioritize the people and the planet. And if they're not able to do that, they should step out of the way and let the people lead. World leaders are representatives of the majority of the planet. They're supposed to be leaders of society, yet they're not actually coming from the majority of people. They're coming from the richest, they're coming from the oldest, they're coming from the whitest. And so these are the same people who caused the climate crisis. So of course it benefits them to continue the climate crisis, to not really stop the fossil fuel industry, to not change the system that we have from a profit-oriented one to a needs-based one that's in line with the planetary limits. And so that's what world leaders need to do, essentially. Really just start recognizing and respecting the physical boundaries of the planet and the human rights that we all deserve. So that means phasing out fossil fuels, for the global north to really pay their reparations to the global south, and for global south leaders to ensure that that financing actually goes to the ones most affected and most impacted, and making sure that the people in the global south especially are no longer threatened by their own governments. Because in countries like the Philippines, we're also one of the most dangerous countries in the world for environmental defenders and activists. So if these world leaders aren't able to do all of this and more for a better planet, then they should just get out of the way and let the people who are actually from the most marginalized sectors of societies take charge and lead us to a better society and better future.
What are the next steps for you in your activism journey, and do you possibly see a career in politics?
People keep asking me this. I don't think so. I don't think I can survive politics. I think it's such a complicated game, and as long as the system hasn't changed fundamentally, the individuals in that will have to play by the rules of that game, and it's really hard. I see myself as a full-time activist and continuing my organizing. Right now, I'm organizing students and young people, but first, I'm looking at organizing small coastal communities in the future with fisher folk. I don't know when yet. It depends on situations and when it makes sense. But right now, I do still see myself in the youth climate movement. And I'm just really excited to also create, I think my role now, after being here for like 6 years now, is to start training other people, which we've been doing since like before, but really now I'm really stepping more into that role of mentorship and connections and building networks, because I think that's what I love being. Like, I love being a bridge of people and connecting the world essentially together, and I think a lot of us will benefit from doing more of that.
So lastly, as we're wrapping up, what does the term climate heroes mean to you?
To me, when I think of it, it's our environmental defenders. So I'm not even part of that. That's the small farmers, the small fisher folk, the indigenous peoples. I think the climate heroes are the people most marginalized and are also on the front line. I think climate heroes are also mass movements. I don't like the idea of individual heroes because it puts up and maintains this idea that, one, we only need individuals who will save us. That's not true. Two, that we also put these individuals on a pedestal as if they have to be a perfect activist. And that means that no one else can join them. And so my whole thing is about showing that we're all heroes, I guess. We're all like, there's no level of expertise that you need before you become an activist. It's low-hanging fruit. It's really easy to do. You can do a few things, do something with the collective group, and you're an activist, right? And the more of us that see that and understand that, the more of us that will do work. And that way, you know, I say this a lot, like, we don't need one perfect activist, but we need millions of bad activists. There's no one perfect thing that needs to happen. And I feel like a lot of superhero movies really show us that, like, the hero is usually really flawed, right? But we forget that part. They are normal people. So that's what we need to remember.